Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, a new collection of trusted resources to help clarify and strengthen your participation in global missions. Visit us online at globalmissionstoolbox.com. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. We know that effective missions-minded churches want to take great care of their workers. Some congregations are now creating small groups of people that care very personally for a mission worker and their family. Today, we'll be unpacking one version of this concept that is working well for several local churches. Our guest today on the Global Missions Podcast is Melissa Weissenberger, who has studied English. She's a writer and has studied secondary English to be a teacher before she became a mission worker in Bolivia with South America Mission, affectionately known to many of us as SAM. She has now transitioned to SAM's central office in the United States, where she serves as mobilization director. This means she focuses on recruitment and training of new workers and also serves as the first contact in setting up a relationship between sending churches and the mission agency. Melissa, welcome to the program.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
I also want to mention that Melissa is a member of the Global Missions Podcast Advisory Group, part of those organizations that are like-minded and contribute especially toward the creative production of this podcast. So we appreciate her serving in that capacity. And now she's on this side of the microphone to talk about some of her specialty and her work at SAM. Melissa, just before we get going, there is this term that we want to define. We're going to talk about interacting with churches, and you've used a term, encouragement and accountability group. It's a big set of words. What do we mean by an encouragement and accountability group?
Yeah, what we mean by an encouragement accountability group is a small group of people committed to emotionally, spiritually, mentally, physically, financially journeying alongside a missionary from their sending church.
So this is not part of the agency. It's actually right in a home church or a sending church.
Correct. You recently had Steve Barron on your podcast talking about the 4 ingredients of a healthy sending church. He said they seek to identify, prepare, send, and sustain cross-cultural workers. And so we see these groups as focusing on the send and sustain portions of that challenge.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we get going, tell us a bit about your experience in working with these types of groups.
So I first joined SAM as a missionary. 8 years ago, I went as a short-term missionary, and I did not have one of these groups. And then I returned for a longer term with my husband, and we formed one of these groups as we require all of our midterm and long-term missionaries to do. Radically changed my experience in my life, and now I have the opportunity to train other missionaries.
Well, glad to hear you've had positive personal experience. You used radical as a word there, so it made a big difference. How can these groups help churches and help mission workers?
Yeah, I've spoken to pastors about their missionary rosters, and I've heard quite frequently that they don't know what's going on with many of their missionaries, or they don't know how to begin to effectively be involved in the lives and ministries of their missionaries. So that's where this core support group enters this scene. These small groups help spread the workload in caring for and supporting missionaries. They ideally provide platforms for the church to communicate. They also regularly engage in member care, which prevents attrition and encourages resiliency.
Mm-hmm. So they're forming a liaison, really, between the church and maybe the pastor's study and office with workers, but they're also directly supporting the worker.
Yeah.
Communication is a big challenge in this. That's one of the things we can talk about, but how do these groups function, essentially?
Essentially, they function almost like a small group or a life group. Some choose to meet weekly, but most meet probably on a monthly basis. And each member of the group brings their own commitment to the table and leverages their own skills for the well-being of the missionary and the effectiveness of their ministry. A lot of times they'll Skype in with their missionary. They all read up on their updates. And in many ways, they become a mediator between the missionary and their church.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could share an example or examples from your experience about how these groups really have successfully and fruitfully helped both the workers and the church.
Totally. So when I first went as a single female missionary for 1 year, I did that thing where I said, thank you very much for your money and see you in 12 months. And I didn't hear from my church and I didn't send anything to my church. But when I went back with my husband, we formed a group and it completely changed the tone of our ministry. Each month that we wrote a newsletter, we wrote it to the general masses, and there were hard things we just couldn't write about publicly. And those things went in a private email to our core group, or our encouragement and accountability group. One member of our group had been in ministry for the entirety of his professional career, and he committed to being a person to provide accountability to us. So if we didn't write a newsletter on time, or if he hadn't heard from us in a while, he'd reach out and set up a Skype call and ask the hard questions and listen to us be very honest about our own failures or disappointments. Another example, we had a young lady who'd been serving in a difficult environment due to team conflict, and she had to come home unexpectedly. She didn't have a place to live, and the leader of her group took her in and lovingly took her cat in as well. And even
That's
though
important.
she had a lot of traveling, she had a lot of traveling to do to visit churches and spend time with our agency, she had a home base that was provided freely and lovingly. Also, while she was still in country, her group visited her halfway through her term and provided immense emotional support to her in a pretty difficult time.
Do you find that these groups are comprised of people the worker already knows before they go, or is it a new group of people that just pick this up at the particular time?
We usually encourage our missionaries to set up these groups themselves, and they often prefer to choose people who know them well already, mostly because they're looking for that emotional support as they're traveling and as they're serving. And in many ways, if you have a new person that doesn't know you, you have to do a lot of legwork to get them caught up on your life and who you are. But that being said, there are lots of people who can easily serve on a group in many capacities, becoming a financial advisor or speaking into, the well-being of your children's education, etc., who may not even know you, but can come to know you over time.
Melissa, how do you see these support groups? I'll use that term just for simplicity today. How do you see them relating to missions committees?
Most of these groups have at least one member who is directly connected to church leadership or who creates a relationship with the missions pastor or missions committee. They become sort of like the church advocate, and they streamline the communication with church leadership and effectively become a stand-in for the missionary themselves.
So there's going to be a pretty wide open communication line between, that person and the church leadership and to the group.
It really depends on the church, too. If your missions committee requires a certain amount of, reporting and whatever, sometimes this person can do that on behalf of the missionary. Because, sometimes it's difficult to get in touch with your missionary in general. So let alone completing reports or, other things that might be required by churches. And so depending on the church, there are people within the group who volunteer to regularly report to whatever the structure is with the church and what the church requires.
And when you think about setting these groups up, who is typically taking the initiative to set these up? Is it the worker or is it the church?
We have it start off with the worker, since they're the ones who really know what they need. But we also always encourage them to find someone who's going to be a rallier in their absence. So the mission worker starts setting up the group, and one of the people that they bring in is the kind of person who knows how to gather people, who knows how to, convince or persuade or encourage or excite. And that person really is key in keeping the group together and adding new members if necessary.
Kind of a catalyst then.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder, what does it look like particularly once this is set up and a worker departs for the field and they're settling into their work in a cross-cultural environment? What does the communication line look like between the mission worker and their group?
So in general, every member of the group is expected to keep up with all of the communications that the missionary puts out. So if there are newsletters, if there's a Facebook group that they have, or if they decide that the mission worker wants to simply send a personal email to the group, every member is expected to receive those communications and spend time reflecting on them. And then each group decides beyond that what other communication is necessary. Some groups decide to Skype in their missionary once a month. Some members commit to deeper levels of communication and encouragement. So they'll FaceTime almost, short FaceTime every other day or something. So in general, they're supposed to keep on top of all the communication and then decide beyond that what their level of commitment is, depending on how they're going to support the missionary.
You just mentioned every other day or something like that. That's a pretty high level of engagement. Would that be typical, do you think, of these groups?
No. It's usually if someone in the group is their best friend or is their brother or,
Got it.
someone who really wants to see their face for 5 minutes in the morning. Or if you really have a missionary going through a period of loneliness, sometimes it's really helpful to commit and say, you know what, I'm just going to call them and have a 5-minute good morning chat for the next week. Not forever, but in this period of time, I notice that they really need some encouragement.
No, that's a great idea. Great sensitivity to the fact that there are seasons and the seasons change, right? It depends, really. Well, if those are some of the ideas in contacting the mission worker, if we turn it the other way, an interaction with church leadership, what does that communication line look like?
So that communication line mostly goes through whoever's the church advocate on the team, primarily because the missionary either doesn't have a lot of time to contact the church, or sometimes they don't even know how. And so the main person who agrees to be the church advocate receives whatever it is from the missionary that needs to be relayed, and then they take it upon themselves to relay that information effectively wherever it needs to go. So if that person's reporting to a missions committee, or if the missionary says, hey, help, my child needs to get into university next year, I don't know anything about sending a kid to college, and that person says, oh, I'll reach out to parents in the church, they take it on themselves to do the communicating.
Mm-hmm. Well, what a special role that is to play to really become, advocate is the word we've used, right? But someone who's really looking out for different angles here. One more question before we take a break, and that is, how does this group interact with the mission agency? In your case, Sam, but there are many others who would be supportive of these ideas. How does that group relate to the mission office?
These groups technically do not exist to support the missions agency in any way. They're really formed within the sending church to help the sending church support their missionaries. But that being said, if the missionary winds up having a serious issue with their agency, members of the group could become an intermediary if it would be beneficial to the missionary to have a third party.
Yeah, hopefully there's a healthy relationship with the agency, but be helpful. Yeah. I wonder, Melissa, just before we take a break, do these groups typically have more than one worker in a portfolio, or is there one group for each worker?
There's typically one group for each worker or each unit, so like a family unit.
Family, yeah.
But, it could be possible that one group takes on 2 units if they feel like they have the capacity. Beyond that, it would stop being as effective, I think.
Sure. Or individuals could serve on more than one group, more than one support group, I suppose, if they had a particular capacity or interest in missions. Well, a very good summary overview of this. In just a moment, Melissa's going to share some ideas about how to actually build one of these encouragement and accountability groups. This is what Sam calls them, encouragement and accountability groups. It doesn't have to officially be called that, right, Melissa?
Correct. You can call it a core group. You can call it a posse. I mean, as long as you know what it is.
Right. There's no trademark on this name here. She's got some ideas about what kind of individuals might participate in this group. And we'll get to that in just a moment. Before we do, we'd like to share with you this missions resource that we hope can be helpful to you and your church.
Would you like to learn more about missions? Are you looking to mobilize your church for global missions? The Kairos course is a 9-session interactive study designed to educate, inspire, and challenge Christ followers to active and meaningful participation in missions. Kairos is offered in many countries and in multiple languages. You can learn more about the Kairos course right here on the podcast by listening to episode 7 with Ron Brown. Visit kairoscourse.org or kairoscourse.ca today to find a course near you. And now, back to today's conversation.
Okay, we're back with Melissa Weissenberger, and we're talking about encouragement and accountability groups that can help mission workers and their churches. There might be another name for these: core groups, advocacy groups, support groups. Melissa, when we think about putting one of these groups together, how does a church go about it?
Usually we see these groups formed by our missionaries. But if the church wants to instigate it, my first suggestion would be getting in contact with your missionary and saying, we would like to form a solid support group for you guys to provide better care and accountability. And then alongside the missionary, help them form members from the congregation who know them well or who are passionate about missions and have something to offer as a group member.
Well, that's going to be an encouragement to many workers if they hear from their church, and there's that initiative coming from the church for sure. I didn't ask this before the break, but do you see a typical size of these groups? I'm sure there's a range, but how big are they? How many people on a group?
They're usually somewhere between 8 to 15 people.
Okay. Wow, that's really substantive then. These are big groups.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So, as we begin to think about this idea, what kind of people should we be on the lookout for?
The most important thing is commitment. Like a small group or a life group, they're committing to meeting regularly, seriously handling the details of the missionary's ministry and personal life. It's not a group that meets up for a year and then dissipates. So it's wise for there to be a variety of ages and life stages. While young people are passionate, if the entire group is young adults, it can be difficult due to the chaotic nature of your early 20s. They also just need to have deep faith and be prayer warriors who are committed to providing scriptural accountability, encouragement, to honestly pray for the spiritual warfare that a lot of missionaries go through.
Well, all these things will be helpful elements. I wonder, when you talked about not being on for a year, do these groups typically form for a particular season? How long do they last?
When we have our missionaries set up the groups, the idea is that they last forever. And by forever, I just mean for the length of the missionary service. And for their successful re-entry when they are done being a missionary. But, of course, there are plenty of reasons why someone might need to leave a group or adding someone might make sense. So they are somewhat fluid as long as there is stability.
Well, I wonder, have you seen these groups formed recently? And can you tell us a story about where you've seen one of the groups really thrive and serve fruitfully?
Yeah, so when missionaries are first appointed and they go into the process of fundraising or partnership development, that's usually when they begin to form these groups. And it's honestly a little difficult at first because you're asking for a very large commitment. Because you're not just asking for, a check for $100 and thank you so much. But once you slowly put this group together, even the first couple of people who are just willing to meet up once a month and pray over your fundraising process, those people slowly help bring in more people. And so, we have people who just became missionaries in June. And right now, at the end of January, they just now have a group of about 6 people. And it's taken them a while. It's a little discouraging at first. But between December and now, we have seen such an improvement in their personal joy and their process. Whereas even in December, they were starting to feel like things were really hard. And is God really calling me to this thing? Because there weren't enough people around them regularly encouraging them.
Well, there's some excellent ideas here, and obviously it's bearing good fruit. If our listeners would like to learn more about this topic, what resources do you have to recommend to them?
There are a few books that I usually recommend. The first is the book that is the basis for this group. It's called Serving as Senders by Neil Parolo.
Sure.
And it breaks down every aspect of how you can support a missionary, even aside from finances. All the many different ways.
Sure. It's a wonderful book. And we have had Neil on this program in caring for returning missionaries, particularly, but just really join Melissa in recommending that as a resource. It'll be in the show notes. I'll let you go on there, Melissa.
Yeah. So another book that I recommend is called Mind the Gaps, Engaging the Church in Missionary Care by David Wilson.
Okay.
And then Well Sent by Steve Barron, who was just on your program.
Some super resources there. We will include all of those in the show notes in case you want to check those out as well. And as Melissa said, some of these folks have been guests on the podcast as well. Melissa, if any of our listeners would like to reach out to you and to follow up on this idea, how could they do that?
Absolutely. I am super passionate about this. You can always email me at melissa@southamericamission.org.
And that also will be in the show notes, of course, if you'd like to reach out to Melissa to unpack some more of these ideas. The last question I have for you, Melissa, is just with regard to standing in front of a mission committee at a church. They would really like to do a great job of missions. Perhaps the pastor is there with them. And if you had a chance to address them, what would you say to them?
I think one of the major issues that's facing the missions community is the yearly statistics on missionary retention and attrition. And there's a lot of talk about member care and how to do it right. And so when I think about missions committees and pastors and wanting to care for their missionaries well, I think these rising statistics tell missions agencies that we need to increase our member care, but also the people who know these missionaries best, who saw them get married, who walked them through their adolescence, are their sending churches. we as missions agencies come alongside them in their adulthood at some point along the way and enable them to do ministry. The people who really know how to care for them are the people who watched them grow up and the people who walked them through some of their hardest moments in life. So these groups are really meant to be a way to provide the best kind of encouragement and the best kind of emotional support.
Well, there's a lot of wisdom, a lot of great practical ideas in this conversation, and appreciate, Melissa, that SAM as an agency is really seeking to lift this idea of support groups or encouragement and accountability groups for their workers. Thank you for sharing this with us today, and may the Lord bless you as you continue to serve Him in this.
Thank you so much.
Well, we hope you found this discussion with Melissa helpful as you think about how to support your mission workers. Perhaps you'll choose to form one of these encouragement and accountability groups, or whatever you choose to call it. Perhaps you already have such a group or something similar, and you would share with us some of what has worked for you. We'd love to hear from you through our email, info@globalmissionspodcast.com, or through our Facebook page or Twitter feed. Remember, you can find the show notes to today's episode at globalmissionspodcast.com, including links to the resources and books that were mentioned. If you enjoyed the episode, we'd sure appreciate a review on iTunes, and we invite you to subscribe through your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. This episode has been brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International and the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives. We also collaborate with other like-minded agencies, including South America Mission, which is Melissa's agency mentioned today. On behalf of our entire team, thanks for listening. Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.